Uh, do you hear me well?
Good morning or good evening.
Yeah, good morning. So it's an honor to see you and to speak with you. Thank you very much for agreeing to participate in our discussion. I'm glad to introduce to you my friend, philosopher Kirill Martynov. He will help me to ask some questions, and I must to beg my pardon for my English pronunciation, because the last time I speak in English was an interview with Massimo Pigliucci 3 years ago, and since then I didn't have any practice, but I hope it won't be a big problem, because I will mainly read out prepared questions and maybe we'll ask some additional ones. And by the way, many thanks to Massimo for helping to organize this event. So we are already on YouTube, and I will make a small introduction. Greetings to all who watch our broadcast within the Moscow Stoa community. Today we are holding discussion with Anthony Long, Professor Emeritus of Classics, University of California, Berkeley, the author of numerous publications on Stoicism in particular, and Hellenistic philosophy in general, as well as translator of the marvelous collection of sources and commentaries on them, the Hellenistic philosophers, on which he worked together with David Sedley. In the discussion also participates philosopher Kirill Martynov, co-founder of the Moscow Free University. Our main topics will be Stoic ethics, especially deontology and the theory of appropriation, oikeiôsis, and maybe a few more additional subjects if we have enough time for them. So I would like to start not from Stoic ethics, but with the context within which it developed. And my first question is about the influences of previous philosophical traditions on Stoicism. The influence of cynicism is well known, so I will ask about a less known subject. In the third book of Nicomachean Ethics, there is a long passage about what depends on us and what doesn't. Aristotle uses such words as ephemine, proairesis, to hegumenon, and others which strongly resemble the Stoic concepts. Maybe ephemine, what is in our control, is a simple colloquial expression, and yet the way Aristotle uses it is very much reminiscent of the Epictetus Enchiridion. The Aristotelian hegumenon also evokes the Stoic hegemonikon. In your article, Aristotle's Legacy to Stoic Ethics, you mention other conceptual intersection between Aristotle and Stoics. So the question is, how great was the influence of Aristotle on Stoic ethics?
Thank you very much for the question. And I very much appreciate your own comments on the third book of Nicomachean Ethics, because when I wrote my article, when I was about your age, I think, or maybe even, I don't know. But I was not at that time very familiar with Epictetus. I was working much more on the early Stoic fragments. And so I didn't even mention proairesis in that article. I think the interesting point about your question is that proairesis, Aristotle's key term, also in the third book of Nicomachean Ethics, meaning in Aristotle something like intention or deliberation, has no apparent use in early Stoicism except a very minor use. Whereas in Epictetus, it does have, it seems, some quite strong connections with the way Aristotle uses it. And so Epictetus is peculiar as a Stoic in bringing this term into prominence. I think one explanation of this is that Aristotle's technical writings may not have been too familiar to the earlier Stoics, but certainly by the time of Epictetus, I think the Nicomachean Ethics especially was being read. You're absolutely right. And I think it's an interesting point I hadn't noticed. You're absolutely right to note the use of hegumenon as well as ephemein in this context. And Aristotle actually uses the word, your word, hegumenon, rather like the Stoic hegemonikon, as one's guiding faculty, as we might say, perhaps the mind in general. I think the difference, however, between what Epictetus is doing and Aristotle is rather strong. Aristotle's interest in that passage in the Nicomachean Ethics is to account for responsibility. What kind of actions can we be praised and blamed for? Well, he says those are the actions where the starting point, the arche, is in us. And so it's a very specific concern that he has here with distinguishing between things that simply happen to us, like a storm at sea, where we have to take some action, but we're not responsible for the storm, and actions where we are responsible. I don't think that prohairesis in Aristotle has quite got the connotations of the will as the kind of dominant faculty, which is really our whole moral center. The earlier Stoics talked, especially in the Roman context, Seneca's notion of voluntas, which again, we might not quite want to translate it as will, but it's very close to that. And so I think that there's a difference. Now, I'd like to say something else. Aristotle's ephemein, as you rightly point out, is crucial in Epictetus. It enables him to make this dichotomy between the things that are up to us and the things that are not. Earlier Stoics were quite strong, especially I think in the case of Zeno and Cleanthes, they are quite strong determinists. Everything is under the control of the divine power that they all so-called fate. And this, of course, raised big questions. If fate is really the dominant causal agency in the universe, what power do human beings have? Chrysippus was challenged about that, and he made a very important distinction between what he called antecedent causes, things that fall outside our actual agency, but are nonetheless part of the context of action, and what he called the principal cause. And the principal cause he wanted to locate in us. That was still left a big question, however, about what kind of autonomy, what kind of volition do human beings have? And I think that what Epictetus is doing, and he may be somewhat original in this respect, is treating agency, human agency, as the dominant proposition, the dominant concept in ethics. And so the ephemein of Epictetus is not just a question of responsibility. It is really what we are. What we are as human beings is agents. And that is, I think, what he's really focusing on with prohairesis.
Thanks. And did have early Stoics concepts ephemein, ephemein?
Yes. We don't have, of course, enough of the earlier Stoic discussions of this. The most important evidence for Stoic ephemein really comes through Cicero. It comes from Cicero's book De Fato, on fate. And that's really, again, the context of it. Whereas interestingly, and this really picks up a point I've tried to make before, Epictetus doesn't discuss fate. He doesn't discuss it. I think he assumes it, but there's no discussion of heimamene, which has been such a huge point of contention between the Stoics and their academic critics before. So again, he's assuming that there is a divine power which is somehow determining agency, but nonetheless, as he puts it, not in the Enchiridion, but in the discourses, God is inside us. God is in control of us. So our own mind is a fragment of the divine, and that's another way I think that he wants to focus on agency. It's not as if there's the divine out there and we are separate from it. We're part of the divine.
Thanks. Also, the influence of Aristotle is a very interesting topic. I will not ask further questions connected with it because otherwise it will lead us too far. Let us turn to the teachings of the founding fathers of Stoicism. I would like to talk about Stoic deontology because it seems to me that this part of Stoicism often remains in shadow of more well-known concepts such as virtue or eudaimonia. At the same time, in my opinion, deontology is the heart of the Stoic ethics. So I will start with what you called in one of your articles the basis of Stoic ethics, namely the interrelated concepts of physis and oikeiôsis. In connection with these concepts, Hierocles has a famous passage about concentric circles spreading around us. The first around our own consciousness, the next one around the closest relatives, and the last around all of humanity. Stoic must treat the contents of the last circle in the same way as the contents of the first ones. In this regard, I have two questions. What exactly was the doctrine of oikeisis? Due to the fragmentary texts, even people who study Stoicism don't always have a clear understanding of this. Further, Hierocles is a late Stoic of the 2nd century, contemporary of Epictetus. Can we find traces of the oikeisis in the first Greek Stoics? And if so, did the early Stoic oikeisis doctrine implying the same concentric model of society as we know from later texts?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, that's some very interesting and very big questions there. And I'm glad you asked me about it because I think oikeisis is perhaps in many ways the most intriguing and original Stoic concept that survives. Let's just go as to Hierocles. Hierocles, as you point out, is a Stoic. We know really awfully little about him, but he's perhaps a contemporary or slightly younger than Epictetus. So he's from the Roman Empire, and I think the concentric circle model. Now this is only my own hunch, is probably more influenced by his context, his Roman context. He talks here about sort of stretching out, as it were, from one's own center right to the sort of furthest limits of humanity. I think Zeno, if we go right back now to the beginning of Stoicism, if we go to Zeno, and we know a little bit about Zeno's Republic, his book about ideal political theory, in which he imagines the world as being a world governed entirely by wise people. He doesn't seem there to be talking about the whole world. It seems almost to be, still modeled upon the idea of something like a Greek city-state, a relatively small community. So I think Hierocles' model of the concentric circles echoes this wider world. Nonetheless, I also think that Zeno was a cosmopolitan. He didn't think that human excellence could be confined or restricted to a Greek community. It was also an ecumenical concept. The idea of, so that's just a thought about Hierocles. On oikeiôsis in general, I've just been having a sort of thought which I haven't developed yet at all, and I don't think other people have, because we don't quite know, what the primary influences were. Obviously, there must have been some influence on Stoicism from perhaps from Aristotle, from people have said from Theophrastus. I myself think that perhaps the strongest influence was Stoic opposition to the Epicureans. Let me explain. In one of our most important Stoic texts, it's in Diogenes Laertius' Life of Zeno, where he starts his account of ethics. And he explains there that the Stoic ethics differs from the Epicurean fundamentally in that Epicureans think that the primary motivation of human beings is the desire for pleasure and avoidance of pain. And the Epicureans described this natural instinct, as they thought of it as human beings, as to what is oikeion. The oikeion thing for a human being is hedonism, is to pursue pleasure, avoid pain. In that very context, although the word oikeiôsis does not occur, the primary facet of oikeiôsis is brought out, which is that the primary instinct of human beings, and indeed of any animal, is self-preservation. It's not the desire for pleasure, it's to become the kind of creature that you are. Oikeios means belonging. It's taken from the word for a house, a household. And so the notion of oikeiosis is playing in Stoicism two rather interesting roles, if I could compare it in a modern way. One is the role of genetics. It's that every creature is primed, is gifted from its outset with certain starting points which are to account for its development, and that we would say is nature. And there's nothing you can do about that. If you are a frog, or if you are a tadpole, you are going to grow into a frog, and there's nothing you can do about that. And human infants can have comparable drives. But oikeiosis is also a normative concept. It's an evaluative concept, and this brings us to the wider context. I think everything in the Stoic universe has value if we think of it in terms of, well, why are the things they are? They are the way they are because a divine and all-knowing and all-benevolent principle has organized the world accordingly. So every organism has a natural starting point, and, if you will, a natural goal. But in the case of humans, there's something. The special thing about human beings is that as we develop consciousness and reason. And so it's not only that we will have a nature, say, to congregate us up with other human beings, to beget children. That's true for all human beings. But we come to see why these are good things. And so the oikeiosis of a human being is a nature which is both, as it were, factual and descriptive, but it's also normative. And it's, I think, perhaps the best way to try and capture it today is to think of it in a kind of ecological way, as how to come to belong. Not you have to come to belong to yourself, but in coming to belong to yourself, you come to see yourself as a member of another kind. And so the idea of appropriation, which Hierocles is talking about, is an extension of this starting point of coming to see yourself as how you fit into the world. And so, coming back to my point about Epicurus, the Stoics would argue that we can't simply organize ourselves as human beings in terms of the pleasure and absence of pain motivations. That's far too restrictive. There's nothing wrong with pleasure or pain or avoidance of pain, but they can't be what we are here for, and they can't be our raison d'etre.
Thanks. So we can say that the doctrine of oikeisis is also basis of Stoic cosmopolitanism. Since you need to appropriate the whole cosmos circle by circle, it means that Stoic is by definition cosmopolitan.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
So another key concept of Stoic ethics is the kathēkonta, or, as you translated it in the Hellenistic philosophers, proper function. First of all, why did you choose this kind of translation? In one of your publications, you emphasize that the translation duty doesn't fit. What is the difference between the Stoic kathēkon and other ancient concepts of duty, for example, the Aristotelian deon? And secondly, how is this concept connected with oikeiôsis?
Yes, thank you. I think the fundamental connection between kathēkon and oikeiôsis, one might say that the excuse me, the kathēkonta are a manifestation of oikeiôsis. So if we take one or two examples of kathēkonta, if you're as a human being, you are primed to be sociable, to honor your parents, to maintain your health. These are the ways that you as a human being, coming back to oikeiôsis, are organized to belong in the world as a healthy, sociable human being. So the kathēkon is a manifestation of this overall sense of trying to belong. Now, on the question of deontology, and I think again it's a very interesting question you've raised and a very difficult one, because if we think of deontology in a modern sense, if we think of it in terms of categorical imperatives, if we think of the notion of Kant, for example, then I think that will get us. We'll go a bit astray there, I think, because I think that there's no question, of course, that deontology is very important in Stoicism, but it's in some sense a kind of conditional deontology. It isn't perhaps the starting point. The first question the Stoic will ask is not so much what ought I to do, but rather how can I become the best possible human being, which of course is a way of saying, how can I achieve eudaimonia? Eudaimonia is a success term. It's how can I achieve the best possible life for a human being? Now, that best possible life for a human being, for a Stoic, is going to involve a great deal of what we might call not perhaps duties, but normative actions. But they're conditioned, I think, on this notion that we don't start. Let's back up a bit. If we think in terms of moral rules, if we think, for instance, say that it is unconditionally necessary and right to keep a promise, the Stoics will not accept this. They don't want, I think, their ethics to be a system of categorical imperatives because, first of all, human beings differ hugely in what they are capable of doing. And also the circumstances are going to be always too variable to enable you to have a kind of rule book. So coming back to your question about proper functions, I wanted to get away from duty because I think duty does set us up puts into a different kind of context. Cicero's de officiis is usually translated as on duties, but it's not really a system of obligations. It's rather that an officium and a kathēkon is a pattern of behavior which is part of the structure of society, and therefore we are obliged, if we are going to be rational beings, to follow these norms. But we don't start off from that. That's not the starting point. We need to remember that for Stoics, the kathēkon extends throughout all the life world. Even plants have kathēkonta. And so higher animals even more so, and human beings especially. But that again, we can't talk about the duty of a plant. We can't talk about the duty of a dog. And so it's not that human beings are born with obligations, but that once they come to understand what the appropriate thing for a human being to do is, once they come to understand that, then we get to what we might call a second order level of understanding. We do what we ought to do, not simply because it's a rule, but because we see why. We come to understand why it's an appropriate thing to do. And I think this is a very important thing. The Stoic is always, I think, not just doing the right thing, but doing the right thing because they come to see that this is the right thing to do.
Thanks. And with connection about these themes, I have a question. With connection with this theme, I have a question about different types of kathēkon. So according to the testimony of Stabaeus and Cicero, there are two kinds of proper functions: teleon kathēkon, perfectum officium, and intermediate, meson kathēkon or medium officium. In addition, in some texts, we also find the notion of proper function depending upon circumstances, kathēkonta peristatika. Could you please clarify what is the difference between all these types of proper functions? And in particular, what is the specifics of the third one, appropriate upon the circumstances? Example of which are the murder of parents, incest, cannibalism, and other shocking acts of Stoic sage, which it would seem are not according at all with nature.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so let's start with what Cicero calls the medium, the intermediate one. So when the Stoics make up lists of appropriate things to do, looking after your health, honoring your parents, honoring your country, these are actions which they're intermediate in the sense that they could be done. You could say that it's appropriate for anybody to do those things, but nonetheless, they can still be done well or badly. So merely to say that it's appropriate to honor your parents, and so somebody is doing that, it doesn't follow that what they're doing is actually what they call a right action, because in order for it to be a right action, it would have to fulfill all the possible virtues, whereas you could be a good son or child or daughter in some sense, but not in another. And so the medium is simply, I think, a way of trying to say we can give a kind of description of appropriate actions, but when we come to moral evaluation and to say, did somebody act well or badly, it's not enough to say that they did this or that kathēkon. It's a matter of how they did it. And this is something that, again, Seneca discusses this quite well when he says it's not just a matter of eating or appropriately, it's how you do it. It's how you put on your clothes. It's the how as distinct from just the what. So so with the teleon kathēkon, the perfect kathēkon, is a way of Cicero sometimes describes that as one includes all the numbers, all the facets of an action. So again, here the Stoics, following very much in a Socratic line from Plato, thought that you can't have one virtue without having the others. It's not that you couldn't perform an action that would be called a courageous act. Of course you could, but the courageous act would not be a full proper functionally done well if it involved, say, some other fault. So the teleo kathēkonta are covering all your bases, and they're doing not only doing the appropriate thing, they're not only doing it for the right reason, but they're doing it in the right way. And so the katorthema, as every katorthema is a kathēkon, but only a very few kathēkonta are katorthemata, because very few people can achieve that kind of perfection of covering all the bases. Now, when it comes to the peristatica, the ones that are conditional on circumstance, Epictetus has a very good example of how to explain this. He says, it's natural for one to for one's foot to be clean. But there would be circumstances when it would be appropriate for it to get muddy or dirty. And so I think here again, the Stoics are doing something quite important in moral philosophy. They're recognizing that you can't ever have a complete rule book. Circumstances are always going to condition the way somebody acts. I think you pointed out in your questions to me that there are some rather bizarre examples. I mean, that it could be appropriate to kill one's parents or to eat one's parents or to commit incest. But again, I think these are meant to be extreme instances. They also, I think, reflect something of the Cynic influence on Stoicism, which, by the way, is, I think we haven't quite talked about that. It would be important to bring this out, that of course what I think is particularly Cynic in Stoicism is the refusal to allow fashions and popular conventions to determine the right. So nature goes beyond all those things. So these examples of incest and cannibalism and so forth are meant to be, I think, rather shocking examples to draw attention to the fact that there could be extreme cases. We can all make those up for ourselves. There could be extreme cases where you would set aside the normal things. Now, here there are going to be some debates about among modern scholars. I mean, I think, for instance, myself, that it's unconditionally appropriate for a Stoic to look after one's health. But suppose you are in a military situation where you've got to risk your life in extreme cold or other. Of course, you will then put your health at risk, but it doesn't mean that you're setting aside the appropriateness of keeping to your health. So that would be an unconditional one, even though there would be exceptions where you would set it aside. But it doesn't mean that if you were writing a Stoic handbook, you would say, well, I can give you examples of cases where somebody would set that aside, but it wouldn't mean that the objective appropriateness of being healthy, etc., was set aside. So I think does that cover more or less what you wanted to ask there?
Yeah, thanks. Kirill, do you have some questions? So I will proceed ask mine.
You can proceed to ask.
Hello. Okay. So since we already spoke about connection of kathēkonta and kathortoma and influence of cynicism, next question will be connected with these topics. It is from my friend, the philosopher from St. Petersburg, Danil Popov. Some scholars viewed the concepts of kathortoma and kathēkon as a contradiction in Stoic doctrine, or at least saw a tension between these notions and tried to reconcile it in one way or another. Do you consider this as a problem of Stoic ethics? And if so, isn't that problem rooted in the Cynic influence on Stoa? Let me explain with a concrete example. There is a point of view that Epictetus emphasizes the role of preferable advantages, proegmena, which is subject of kathēkon, because adheres to more tough version of Stoicism, corresponding to the cynicism and Aristotle of Chios rather than to Zeno or Chrysippus. Based on this, one might say that appropriate action was a more Stoic orthodox concept, while perfect virtuous action and ideal of the Stoic sage are rather closer to cynicism, hence a tension between these concepts.
Yes, interesting question. I mean, undoubtedly there was a debate between Zeno and Aristo, and Aristo, of course, in the end lost out. I mean, Aristo was regarded by later Stoics as unorthodox and deviant. And actually in his own lifetime, I think he was an extremely prominent figure and a very interesting one. I don't think there's a contradiction. It is true between kathēkon and katorthema, or the problem of the preferred indifference. It is true that Epictetus does not use the terms. He doesn't talk about the preferred things. But in the passage I mentioned earlier, where he says, quoting Chrysippus, that wherever the outcome is uncertain, I will follow those things which are according to nature. But if I knew now that it was fated for me to be ill, I would embrace illness. So, of course, Stoics are not omniscient. They cannot know the future. And so the proegmena and the apoproegmena offer themselves as guidelines for action where you're not clear what the appropriate thing to do is. Now, it seems as if Aristo wanted to place Aristo wanted to reject the idea that there are objective situations. Everything was to be determined by the wise man's own decision. But I think Cicero in the De Finibus gives a good response to the orthodox Stoic rejection of Aristo, because if you say there are no objective standards beyond the wise man's judgment, that doesn't give much hope for most of us. It's putting too much emphasis on an extremely, developed reason. And even then, I think, while the Stoics don't want to say that you need material goods in order to be successful and happy, they couldn't have an adequate social philosophy unless they thought it was appropriate to try to promote good health and so forth. So I think that I don't think there's a need ever to think of a contradiction. The katorthema is simply, as I tried to say before, it is a perfect kathēkon. So it's not that the katorthema is in any way inconsistent, but it's, of course, perhaps something that's very rarely achieved, because Stoicism is a philosophy of perfection. That's something else we might want to talk a bit about when we get into the question of deontology, is the importance of the notion of progress. But I shouldn't interrupt your order. We'll perhaps come to that later.
Thanks. Question related to the debates of Zeno and Aristotle.
Yes.
Do you think that Stoic philosophy is a single unified system, and the criterion is devotion to the dogmas of Zeno, or it is only formally unified but internally controversial set of contradictory teachings? Aristo versus Zeno, early Stoa versus middle Stoa, and so
on. Good question. I think there is one key doctrine which unifies all Stoics and sets them against all the other ancient schools, and I think also against the later ethical tradition in general. It is what's expressed in Greek as monon to kalon agathon, the unity of good. The idea not only that there's only one species of goodness, but goodness is not additive, it is absolute. That idea, of course, is extremely controversial, and we could spend a long time trying to analyze exactly what it means. But I think it is crucial to the Stoic outlook on life, which is that however important it may be for social life and one's own well-being, to look after one's health and so forth, there's only one formula for a totally successful human life, and that is the perfection of reason. And reason is not a material thing. It is a state of mind. It is a sense of understanding. And in saying that that's the only good thing, what the Stoics are saying, I think somewhat paradoxically, but deliberately so, is that if you achieve that, then you have all that you need in order to live well. Other things could be there and might be attractive, and one can't ignore them in order to live a human social life. But the fundamental ingredient of a good life is this notion of the perfection of reason. And so that what they're doing is take Aristotle. Aristotle says there are many kinds of goods. There are goods of the body, there are goods of the mind, there are external goods. They're all good in the sense that they're worth having. So that we could say. And Stoics are saying, no, it's a mistake to put those things together because there's something so special about the good of reason that it can't be, it's incomparable. And Seneca again has some very good essays in the letters where he explains how there's nothing incremental about goodness. It's an extremely controversial idea. I think that when I touched upon the notion of progress a moment ago, I think it's partly an extremely interesting idea that you can never get there. It's almost, here's the paradox. The paradox is that there's only one thing that's ultimately good, which is the perfection of reason. And yet, how do you get there? Well, you get there by trying to get there. But then here again, of course, the Stoics, and Epictetus does this extremely well, are putting all the value here on intention. And I mean, perhaps too much so, because we might say, well, what about consequences? What about results? But they provide the context. They provide the context for the Stoic. So I think that this now. So the question then is, you can vary how you approach these different, how you approach this univocity of goodness. But I think that unites all Stoics. There have been attempts in the past to try and say that Parnasius and Posidonius were sort of weakening that central doctrine, but I don't think they've been successful. And I think it's certainly as strong in Seneca as it is in the early Stoics. Even though Seneca, of course, is very much speaking for the ordinary people, but he has no doubt at all about the correctness of that doctrine.
Thanks. The next question on the different topic may be most important for me. So I recently watched a lecture by Gisela Stryker on Cicero's De Officiis and the ideas of Panetius peri kathēkontos embedded in it. And I liked her idea that this treatise of Cicero is an attempt to present the basics of Stoic ethics without involving physics, dogmas about nature, logos, and so on. So Stryker asks, how can one understand without all these concepts that virtue is worth striving for? We can know virtue as something of value simply by admiring the beautiful behavior and inner beauty, to kalon, honestum, of other people, and vice versa. In order to achieve this desired virtue, we must lead a life that will delight other people in the same way. Hence, the social role of moderation, temperance, and any other appropriate decorum virtue, which simultaneously serve as an example and testify to the moral beauty of the owner. So my question is related to this. Do you agree that virtue for Stoics, whether we are talking about justice, courage, or any other, is initially a social concept that has meaning primarily in the face of society, that all Stoic virtues are, as it were, turned towards society?
Thank you. It's a very good question, and I actually was present when Gisela Stryker gave that lecture in Berkeley some years ago. It was a very successful lecture. Let me take your last question first. So yes, I do think that the four Stoic cardinal virtues, courage, justice, moderation, and wisdom, they're all. I do think that they're all social virtues. That is to say, they are. When we look at the definitions of them, say courage and knowing what to be endured and feared, justice, how things are to be distributed, they are certainly meant to enable a Stoic to face society and contribute to society. There's nothing introverted about these virtues, even wisdom. And in some sense, wisdom is the key to all those virtues. And it's interesting just to come to the question about how we behave and achieve these. Seneca again has a very good letter where he says, how is the good to be learned? And he says, well, we look around at the world and we see somebody doing something and we think it's great that what they're doing, and that's perhaps a courageous person, but then we discover that person was also a fraud, a cheat or something like that. So we realized that there was only a kind of partial virtue to that person, and then he says, and then we try to imagine somebody who somehow achieved excellence in all possible domains. And the beauty of that action impressed us, and so we formed an idea of virtue that way. So yes, I think something actually when I gave this lecture in London years ago, the Stoicon, I tried to emphasize the notion of beauty as a key Stoic notion. I mean, when we take the Greek phrase monon to kalon agathon, and it might be translated as something like only the noble is good, or only the morally good is good. But I think it has an aesthetic quality. I think that's what you were trying to bring out with your question. It's this notion that beauty shines in the world, and so when we see beauty, if we see beautiful people acting beautifully, it has a kind of inspirational effect on others. Now, I like that idea, and it's one that Cicero in the De Officiis seems to emphasize particularly, in the notion of decorum, the decet in Latin, it shines and so forth, and it's been translated in German as sittlich schöner, sort of sittlich schön, morally beautiful. So far, so good. Now, can we sort of make that the foundation of Stoic ethics and junk the physics and junk the theology? I don't think we can, because you might say, well, I think all these people are acting wonderfully and I admire them, but I don't see why I have to go that way. What is there about their behavior that requires me to do it? What is the motivation to do it? Suppose I just don't want to act in that way. Is that going to make it fulfill me? I think we need the naturalism. I don't think you're not going to get, I think, the oikeiôsis, which we talked about before, simply from observing people acting in a beautiful way. And so there's a big question, I think, about why Panaetius, if Cicero is reporting him correctly, emphasized discounted the theology. I can see why Gisela Stryker is attracted to that, because as a modern philosopher, we may find Stoic theology and stuff about nature, unpersuasive. It's been a lot of problem, I think, for a lot of modern Stoics to how to deal with the notion of providence, divine providence. And we could talk about that at great length. I do think myself that Stoicism would lack a very important dimension. I tried to explain this with oikeiôsis, where I sort of, and even your concentric circles example, that the Stoicism, I think, does require one to look at the world as an ordered structure in some way, even though that gives us huge problems about, you know, evil and disaster. How can we talk about a well-ordered world? Climate change, you know, we may be destroying the world. How can it be a well-ordered world? There are huge answers to that question. One answer would be, well, it's up to us. It's up to us to as citizens of the world, to do our part. But I think this external dimension of Stoicism, to my mind, although I'm not a theist myself, but I am attracted to the idea of the natural world as having structure, and that somehow it's the ethically appropriate thing for us is to try to reproduce that kind of structure in ourselves. And that's perfectly consistent, I think, with what you were saying about what Stryker was saying. But I think it's a dimension that is missing from the work on duties.
Yeah, thanks. So we don't have much time left. I will ask, I hope, a rather small question about my favorite treatise of Seneca, the Beneficiis, which I personally consider one of the pinnacles of Roman Stoic philosophy. Did the Greek Stoics have concepts similar to the Latin Beneficium, or was it a development of Seneca's own?
By the way, I'm very glad you asked me that question, because I was on vacation last week and I took the De Beneficiis with me, and I reread the first two books. And although he does repeat himself a lot, I do think you're right. It is a marvelous work in many ways, and it brings out the extreme importance of volition and judgment. I mean, that the whole point of a beneficium is that your intention to give it, and the importance for the recipient of thanking you is again in their intention. Now, to your main point, I think it's very much a Roman work. The Greeks, certainly there were works, I think, on benefits, though beneficium is an especially Roman notion, because it was a society that ran upon these reciprocal actions of, you do something for me and I have to do something in return. And that was of course, is true perhaps of all societies, but it was especially true of the Roman one. So I think it is a particularly Roman work, but it wasn't. But Seneca makes it clear that he is drawing on a Greek author called Hecatone. Hecatone was a Stoic professor of Stoicism. I mean, writing around the time of Cicero. So Seneca has a real Greek source there, but I think he's adding into it a lot of Roman material of his own. But I think it's a work that has been neglected. I think very few of modern Stoics are reading it. I'm very glad you like it, and I think it could be a very basic. If you're teaching Stoicism in a university class or a school class, it would be a very good work to start from.
Yes, I totally agree with you. So, Kirill, do you want to ask some question? Either I will ask my last question and we will end discussion.
Well, I listened your discussion. It was great, and I have no questions. Thank you.
Thanks. So if you let me, I'll ask last question. That was tormenting me for a long time. Why do you think the Enchiridion of Epictetus doesn't contain such important Stoic term as virtue, ἀρετή? The word ἀρετή doesn't occur in treatise once. Does this mean that Roman Stoics had no need for the complex and abstract Greek concepts, and even without them, Stoicism worked perfectly well for Romans?
Good question, and a difficult one. Well, you're absolutely right. Of course, the Enchiridion does not use the term ἀρετή. but the Enchiridion is Arrian's summary of Epictetus, and we have, of course, there were 8 books of discourses. We have 4 of those, and although ἀρετή is not a very prominent term in Epictetus's discourses, it is certainly present, and it's quite an important term there. So that doesn't solve the question. Epictetus used the term ἀρετή. Why doesn't Arian use it? I'm not sure that I have a very good answer to that. I think when you look at the Enchiridion in general, because it's just a short work, 52 little excerpts, it's really not, I think, designed as an introduction to Stoicism. It's really intended to capture various moments. When you go to the bathhouse, somebody does something, somebody is rude to you. Well, that's their problem. Don't get angry. So it's these individual episodes of life which he's picking out in the Enchiridion. That's one way to look at it. And another word, of course, it's totally missing from the Enchiridion is the idea of wisdom, the key. And so I don't think it's a matter of not Roman, because Seneca is always speaking of virtus and always speaking of sapientia. So it's not that there's something funny for the Romans there. Perhaps another way to look at it would be that both Epictetus and perhaps to some extent the Enchiridion are interested in, they're very interested in the idea of progress, not of Stoic perfection, but of trying, and ἀρετή, of course, is the pinnacle. It is the complete achievement of wisdom, and so that's not really part of the agenda, I think, for Epictetus or Arian in the Enchiridion. So I think it's so I would say yes, Epictetus in the full discourses, he does make quite an important use of ἀρετή, but it is I say a bit understated, and I think that my main explanation for that would be the emphasis not on where the final destination of Stoicism, but is the idea where you're trying to get.
Thanks a lot. So our time is coming to an end, and actually I have few more topics I would like to discuss, but I suggest we maybe postpone them for next time, which I hope will happen maybe at Stoicon week this October, if Anthony agrees to participate. So I propose to end our discussion here, at least for today. Thank you very much, Tony. It was a great pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stanislav. I'm very honored too. I'm very happy to have met you, and hope we'll have more encounters in the future.
Yes, thanks to everyone who watched us. All the best. Goodbye.
Goodbye.